Peter Jackson's documentary about the final live performance of the legendary band The Beatles has debuted on Disney+, but is this 8-hour documentary worth your time? Let's find out. There are only a few subjects in the world that I would want to sit through an 8-hour documentary that chronicles the most finite details of its subject matter. And it just so happens that the Fab Four themselves would be one of those topics. For myself, more than half my life, I've been a massive Beatles fan. When I was in grade school, I was absolutely obsessed with the Beatles. That's all I would listen to, and I searched far and wide trying to get my hands on all of their albums, which at that time I was buying CDs, plus also trying to watch any documentary that would tell me more about this band. So when I talk about this documentary, just know that this isn't necessarily going to be an objective look at this. For myself, there is a lot of emotional and knowledge-based baggage as well going into this. And what I mean by that is, at this point, what else really could be said about the Beatles after the dozens and dozens of books and documentaries that have chronicled their tenure as a band, which, keep in mind, was only for about 8 years? And when you have something like the Beatles Anthology, which is this mammoth 11.5-hour documentary that tells the entire story of the Beatles, at least the story up to that point in 1995, which was well before the death of George Harrison, of course, and when something like the 2016 documentary, for example, 8 Days a Week, comes out, I find something like that, as a diehard Beatles fan, to be pretty ordinary. Because when you're the most famous band, arguably, in the history of the world, it's difficult to offer a unique perspective or show viewers, or better yet, Beatles fans, something that they've never seen before. So when you have Get Back, a documentary which is about an era and a subject that has been covered before in other documentaries and also albums like Let It Be Naked, I was really curious to see what we haven't seen before. And by compiling over 50 hours of never before seen footage and over 150 hours of never heard audio, it actually presents an opportunity to explore this era in the Beatles' career, which really has been portrayed pretty dishonestly and from a certain narrative angle up to this point. And to put the cherry on top of everything, having it being directed by none other than Peter Jackson himself, who recently has been like this guru at remastering old footage and making it look more updated with his crew at Weta Digital. My God, what an absolute dream come true combination, and just something that you never really think that you would see, let alone on Disney Plus of all streaming services. You have all of those components which culminate into creating something that, in my opinion, is not just required viewing for any Beatles fan, but for fans of rock and roll. Although, no, these are not the final days of the Beatles, it starts to provide clarity on not just a pretty tumultuous period in the band, but also what eventually leads to their last public performance as the Beatles. And in that, you're really able to see the other side, in a way, of the Beatles documentaries that we've seen before. We know what the tabloids were saying. We've seen the interviews that have happened after this. Paul especially has been incredibly open about what led to the Beatles eventually breaking up, but being actually able to see this unfold, to actually see these conversations happen, and see how the rapport was between the band members, it's simply fascinating. And speaking of Paul having since been pretty open about this time period, something I loved about this doc is how it portrays, and not even really portray, because it kind of just shows how it happened, but it shows the involvement of Yoko Ono and how that affected the band. There's actually a really almost kind of tragically funny moment in this documentary where all of the band members, except for John and their wives, as well as some of the producers, are having a conversation about Yoko Ono and her impact that it is having on the band. She's been there during the recording sessions, and everyone pretty unanimously is like, hey, it's none of our business. It's also not that big of a deal. And the funny part about that is Paul makes this kind of offhanded comment about how in 50 years or so, people are going to be pointing their fingers at Yoko Ono for breaking up the Beatles because she sits on an amp or something, which he of course says in jest, but That's actually what happened. For years, Yoko was public enemy number one for causing the breakup of the Beatles, despite Paul being very open about what actually broke them up. But for this doc to just kind of show that, how Yoko behaved during these recording sessions, it really just sheds light and some clarity on things. But something else that I just found so tremendously unique about this documentary is how it reinforces why the Beatles are the Beatles, but also it kind of demystifies them in a way. And what I mean by that is, in this documentary, with it being as robust and in-depth as it is, you are really able to see the creative journey that these songs go on. For example, there's a clip making the rounds on Twitter right now, so you've probably seen it, but it shows Paul just kind of sort of noodling on the guitar, and he just stumbles into Get Back. No, it's not exactly the eventual, what becomes the final product of that song that you would hear on the record, but this moment just sort of documents this period in rock and roll history, and it's breathtaking to see it unfold. And it reminds you why the Beatles are as influential as they are, and why Paul McCartney is seen as one of the most brilliant songwriters of his generation. And you also have other moments that, in a way, I found to be almost more captivating, because throughout this documentary, you have moments like the one I just mentioned, but also you have moments where the band is working tirelessly to try and crack a song that isn't quite working. Throughout the entire documentary, you see them workshopping and refining the long and winding road. And even towards the end of the documentary, Paul is still not entirely happy with songs like Let It Be, for example, which of course is why this album came after Abbey Road, because he wasn't happy with it. It just sort of kind of shelved it for a bit. But to me, those moments, the scenes where Paul and George and John are trying to nail down a song, but there are still pieces of it missing, that is what I really loved about this, because in moments like that, it does sort of demystify the Beatles in a way and show that they didn't just kind of wake up and know every single song. And when they were writing this stuff, they weren't like, oh yeah, this is gonna change rock and roll forever. Yes, obviously, these guys are geniuses, but it didn't just sort of happen. They had to work for it, which to be seen chronicled on screen, I thought was fascinating. And sure, I could totally understand if someone who was not a Beatles fan or a fan of this era of music in general watching this or whatever, they would likely be bored out of their mind. This documentary isn't really for the faint of heart because it is so thorough in its investigation of the Beatles, and there are moments that if you are a diehard Beatles nut and you know the larger context of the situation and how they got here, that does enrich your experience. An example of that is the Quarrymen. And they mention it in the doc, and it's something that I found so touching and really to be the sort of thesis for the entire documentary, and has honestly changed how I view the Beatles in this era, but was how Paul precisely wanted to get back, in a way. Not only get back to their roots and rock and roll roots the band was doing when they were in a band like the Quarrymen, the name of the band they were in before the Beatles, but also get back to the sort of attitude of that era. Get back to the time before they were the biggest band in the world and every step they made was publicized in the tabloids, and just be four friends making music together. There's a moment in this documentary where you can see the lyric sheets for one of the songs that Paul is working on, and at the bottom of it, it is signed The Quarrymen. To me, that is the thesis. That is the big idea of this documentary. No, it's not just showing this important time in the Beatles' story and showing them try to make this album. Yes, that's obviously a part of this, but that's not everything. To me, that is why this documentary just sort of sat for so long, because there really wasn't a story until you're able to look back at this band in hindsight and know what eventually happens to all of them. Because one of the filmmakers who actually is working on this documentary, like at that time, says that there's really not much of a story here. But when you are able to see this and have all of the knowledge and all the legacy of the Beatles and the tragedy of not only what happens to John and George, but also Beatles manager Brian Epstein, and how that all affected the groups and the remaining survivors of the band, there's just so much going on here other than just kind of watching these guys, dick around on the guitar for 8 hours. Because I truly believe this is one of, if not the best music documentaries I have ever seen. And it's because it's so much more than just kind of telling you what happened during a band's tenure. It's truly an emotional examination of the Beatles. And I think that if you are a fan of rock and roll history, and especially if you are a fan of the Beatles, you owe it to yourself to check this out, which is now streaming on Disney Plus. So did you guys see the Beatles Get Back? I'd love to know what you thought about it. Leave your thoughts and opinions down below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching today. I hope you liked today's video. And if you did, you can click on the link down below where you can subscribe to my channel to see more movie reviews and movie related things. Again, guys, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.